So, welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. This is the second part of the conversation between Boaz Ganor and me. My name is Bart Collard. If you haven't watched the first one, watch the first movie first, because otherwise you'll be in the middle of a very interesting conversation without knowing the basis of it. So, let's get started. Boaz, why is the statement one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter true, but also dangerous and misleading?
Well, it's misleading because it's mixing between goals and means. In our previous discussion, we differed between terrorism as a goal or terrorism as a mean, and we said that terrorism is the deliberate use of violence aimed against civilians in order to achieve political ends, i.e. it's a mean, it's a modus operandi. But when you are saying one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter, it sounds reasonable. Well, we know in the history of many people that we refer to them as freedom fighters, but practically conducted terrorism, and vice versa, that we refer to them as terrorism, and they wanted to achieve freedom. That's true, one cannot dispute that. But it's misleading because it confuses the goals and the means. The goal is freedom in that case. The mean is deliberate use of violence aimed against civilians, i.e. terrorism. Once you confuse the two, you are conducting intentional misleading activity because you're telling to the people, you know, we cannot refer to anyone as terrorist because one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. And using this slogan that sounds reasonable but is misleading, it's the main argument that any person who is against any definition, apparently my definition, but any definition of terrorism, is using all the time. They would say terrorism is a subjective term because one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. Therefore, we cannot define terrorism. Therefore, we should abandon the effort to agree on one definition of terrorism. And I disagree. Terrorism is a mean. It's the deliberate use of violence aimed against civilian targets. And therefore, we can agree that even if you have a just cause, even if you have a holy cause, even if you are fighting for the freedom, and I do believe that this is a holy cause, you do not have the right to deliberately attack civilians. This is something that can be agreed.
Yes, because this phrase, one could say that it legitimizes the violence against civilians because everything is relative.
Exactly.
And therefore it also makes it harder to combat it. Because we might, if it will, I think this sentence makes it harder to get an international consensus.
Definitely, I can vouch for that. Every time I try to persuade different audiences on that, I have at least one person who's stepping out and saying, but one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. And I'm saying, even if it's true, it's a subjective observation on something that we can and should define objectively and not subjectively.
All right, thank you. So then we already touched upon it briefly in the first part of the conversation. So what is the difference between what we could call a regular criminal and a terrorist?
It's quite simple. It's the motive. If you have a political motive, again, in the broader sense of the term, it could be internal politics, external politics, extreme ideologies, communism, fascism, anarchism, anti-Semitism, which is also an ideology in this regard, and so on and so forth. If you are being motivated by religious grievances that has a political inclination, creating a caliphate state, which means toppling down regimes and creating a new state, which will be a caliphate state, all of those are political motives. And any violent, deliberate violent activity which is being conducted in order to promote that and aimed against civilians, that is terrorism. Unlike regular so-called criminal activity, which practically might do the same. Criminals as terrorists can kill, murder, take hostages, destroy property, and so on and so forth. They do the same, but the purpose is different. And then the question is, why should we differ? Why should we care that the purpose is different? Because I would argue when you're conducting these types of crimes and your goal is a political goal, you do not pose a risk only to one person or a group of people. You are a threat to the whole society, to the civil society. You are a threat to the political order. And therefore, it's a double threat compared to a regular crime.
Yeah, and what I find interesting, and you probably have those cases as well in Israel. We have one criminal who is in custody in the Netherlands, and he's being charged for quite a few murders. He didn't do them himself, but he gave the order. At least that's what they charge him of. And he's like the head of an international network, which is probably dealing in a lot of drugs and that kind of stuff. But what's interesting is his methods in crime, and also in trying to influence judges and the media. So he over the past few years, he's been accused of shooting a lawyer, of shooting a crime reporter, a journalist who was involved in the case, of shooting the witness of the brother of a witness in the case against him, actually. And because of all of this that happened, we have dozens, maybe hundreds of politicians, of journalists, of prosecutors, of judges that have to be secured by the state. So they have bodyguards. Some even have safe houses. And now we have discussions in the Netherlands as to whether this man should be regarded as a terrorist. And probably he checks all the boxes, but the one big discussion point is the intention. Like, does he have like a political motive? Well, on the one hand, people debate it's definitely not very strong represented there, but some people argue that it might be because he really is trying to be above the law. He's trying to maybe like shake the fundamentals of our open societies a bit. With everything he does. On the other hand, no, it's a personal motive he has. It's all about money, status, and frighten people, judges even, to get him out of the jail. So how do you feel on with these
first of all, it's a fair debate. When we take the fundamental concepts that I've described on the definition of terrorism, that kind of debate is needed to be discussed. And at the end of the day, the answer would refer to the factual information itself. Look, in criminal codex, as you know, motive is very important. It's not just what you did, it's also why did you do that. You have murder in first degree and second degree and so on, and killing and so on and so forth. And it influences the judgment at the end of the day. Same thing here. But at the same time, one need to remember that terrorists sometimes, not sometimes, in many cases, are involved also in regular criminal activity. They are involved in drug dealing. They are conducting abduction for the purpose of gaining money, and so on and so forth. But then the question is, why did they do that? Is this part of the terrorist activity? Is this aimed to at least partially fund terrorist organization or terrorist causes or terrorist activities, and so on and so forth? All of those are factual information that needed to be discussed when a debate like that is on the table.
Yeah, I agree. Very important. And related to this motive, because I want to talk a little bit more about the motive the terrorist has. We talked about Daniel Reichner in the first part of our conversation. I remember him mentioning to me an article in the Lebanese criminal code. I found that English translation of it, so it might not be perfect, but I think it was approximately what it should say. Let me read that to you. It says, a motive shall be honorable if it is characterized with magnanimity and high-mindedness, and if it is not marked by selfishness, personal considerations, and the prospect of material gain. That's the end of the quotation. And in the case of such a motive, the perpetrator of, let's say, a murder will receive a significantly lower legal punishment. So why do you think that is the case in a country as Lebanon?
First of all, naturally, the Lebanese legislators didn't consult me before writing this law, because if they would, I would say this is, how would I say it politely, not a very smart article within a law.
So
And
you,
why?
so you have 10 seconds to influence them to contact you, to change the law there.
So, and why do I say that? Because the term honorable is a subjective term. And you cannot include subjective terms in this type of legislative activity or judgments like that, because honorable is different from place to place. You know, when I wrote my definition, I used to use many years ago, in the first version of my definition, the term deliberate attack against innocent civilians. And then after a while, I said, no, innocence, it's a subjective term. Whoever I would refer as innocent, my enemy would not refer as innocent, and vice versa. But civilians, it's an objective term, because civilians is something that can be measured by international guidelines and so on and so forth. And we have those guidelines within the international humanitarian law. Honorable is a problem. Honorable, I mean, take, for example, a suicide attacker, a person who is ready to kill himself for the purpose of killing others. And as you know, because we learned that in my class, suicide attacks is the smart bomb of the terrorist. This is the most dangerous, cruel atrocity of terrorism. Yet, many people would refer to that as an honorable thing, because this person was altruistic. He was ready to kill himself for the cause, for what he refers to as a just cause altogether. We should not mix between subjective observation on an activity that is being conducted by this person or the other person with the objective observation of what he did. What was the measure that he was using altogether? And this is why I would not accept this difference. I do accept that motive is important. As I said before, murder of first degree, second degree, and so on and so forth. Is the motive political or not political? This is important, but not if it's honorable or not honorable.
Yes, and it's very interesting that you mention altruism versus egoism as well, because that's always a debate that I think it's an interesting debate to have behind closed doors, but it's very confusing if you do it in public. But before I give you my thought on this, let me ask you. So what do you think about that? Because I mean, when we talk about your definition and about the difference between a criminal and a terrorist, obviously the discussion between altruism and egoism comes in mind. And let me ask you, what is worse, like the terrorist who has an altruistic goal behind it, in his opinion, or the criminal who has an egoistic goal behind it?
I definitely believe that the terrorist with the altruistic goal is more dangerous than the egoistic one. Mm-hmm. And why is that? Because of the question of copycat, because of the question of incitement, because of the question of brainwashing. Especially when we talk about religious terrorism or terrorism which is being motivated by religious grievances, it always or almost always include the concept of altruism. And terrorist organizations and the inciter for terrorism always use this concept of altruism as a reason or an argument in order to persuade others to follow the model of this or the other terrorist. Because look at that person, he was ready to give his life for a certain cause. You want to be regarded as a holy, as altruist, as this person, don't you? Mm-hmm. And therefore, it makes that phenomenon, in my view, much more dangerous than egoistic violent activity.
Yeah, I fully agree on this. I would say if you see it through a moral perspective, one could argue that a terrorist a criminal shooting his competitor, not a criminal, or the terrorist killing a civilian, but then the one with the altruistic and the other with the egoistic motive, then in that case, I think it's clear that, okay, killing the civilian for the altruistic motive is worse. But I think it becomes interesting once you say, okay, let the criminal kill a civilian randomly or for whatever reason, and the terrorists kill a civilian, and so sort of eliminate the differences in context, but only keep the motive. I think it would be a fair debate, but it's irrelevant. But it would be a fair debate if you say, okay, but in that case, altruistic person from a moral perspective might be less. It might be less bad. Let me put it in that way. But I think it's very dangerous, to think in this way, because, like you say, copycats is very, very, I think, a very relevant argument. But maybe also that if you start thinking in this way, then we should never. I think that should be the bottom line, and that's also the bottom line in your definition. We should never accept any sort of violence against civilians, whether you really believe that you're doing good for humanity. Use other methods, but never use violence against civilians. I
fully agree with you, Bart, but I'm trying to speculate on what you have said, and I'm asking myself, what would be an example of a criminal, non-terrorist, altruistic attack against civilian? Robin Hoodic type of activity? Well, you know what? Robin Hood is based on ideology. And therefore, if Robin Hood deliberately attacks civilians, he's a terrorist.
It would be a terrorist, yes.
Yeah.
So I would more or less think of doing a criminal act in which you kill a civilian with the purpose of getting out or getting away with it, something like that. Then,
but that would be egoistic, not altruistic.
Yeah, then probably, yeah. So the criminal is always egoistic. Yes, that's my point. So the criminal is always egoistic, but I would say then if you would have two murders on a civilian from a moral perspective, there you can have the discussion. If it's just the criminal attacking from an egoistic perspective, a civilian, and the terrorist from an altruistic, then you can have a discussion. But it's a misleading discussion, because we should keep that bottom line clear. Never accept civilian
But
targets.
I think, although it's misleading, as I explained, I do believe that when people are being motivated by or reflecting altruistic deliberate murders of civilians for a purpose, that might be a bigger danger, because it will incite others to follow them.
Exactly. Yeah, completely agree. Okay, so let me ask you some questions about the PowerPoint sheet. When I was still your student, you showed us a model that explains terrorism by an organization based upon operational capacities of the organization and its motivation to commit attacks. And you were so generous to allow me to use that PowerPoint sheet in my education. So let me see if I can share my screen and pull it up, and maybe you could share your thoughts about it. So explain it to our viewers. Share.
I'll start doing that while you are.
Yeah, go ahead.
Practically, what I suggest as a very embryonic understanding of terrorism is that terrorism is a function, if you wish, or a formula of two elements. It's motivation, multiple operational capability. It means that when you have a group of people that has motivation to conduct terrorist attacks under the definition that we have discussed, and they have the operational capability that allows them to materialize the motivation, then a terrorist attack would occur. That's the embryonic understanding of what terrorism is as a modus operandi. From the formula of terrorism that I described, one can conclude what should be the formula of counterterrorism. And the formula of counterterrorism is the same formula. If you want to be effective in counterterrorism, you either need to find a way to eliminate or to narrow down the motivation that gives birth to terrorism. And this is, by the way, CVE, countering violent extremism. Or you need to fight them and dilute their operational capability by destroying their weapons, their resources, arresting them if needed, killing them. And that would be counterterrorism versus CVE. In this pyramid diagram, I actually asked the question, what should be the goals of counterterrorism activity? And I differ between three levels of goals of counterterrorism. The highest level is eradication of terrorism. And it's a very difficult level to reach, but still there is a question, should we put that as the ultimate goal of the counterterrorism policy or the counterterrorism strategy? And when we say eradicate terrorism, it could be annihilating the organization or solving the root cause, CVE or CT, countering motivation or countering capability. Of course, it could be both. Very difficult. That's a different discussion. But theoretically, I would prefer to do both at the same time. The second level is when you are telling yourself, well, I have no capability. I'm incapable of eradicating terrorism. So at least I need to see that terrorism will not be worsened. I can live with what I have now, and I have to focus in the goal of counterterrorism in damage control, to see that there would not be some kind of deterioration of terrorism. It could be by minimizing the fatalities or preventing a certain kind of attacks. Excuse me, this level actually wants to lower down terrorism, not to, is not satisfied with the situation, but want to lower down terrorism, not to eradicate terrorism, but to lower down the level of terrorism by minimizing the fatalities, the injuries, or preventing a certain type of attacks. The third level is satisfying with what we have, and this is prevention of escalation. I don't want to lower down the level of terrorism, but I want to see that it won't be escalated further than that, either by preventing specific attacks or preventing the escalation of the conflict as a whole altogether. Now, that leads to many interesting questions, because based on that, we need to define, adopt, and structure our counterterrorism policy. You can imagine that you would have a different policy if you want to eradicate terrorism, and a different policy if you want to prevent the escalation, and a different policy if you want to control the damage altogether. But there is another question which is even more interesting, is that as a decision maker, what is the goal that you want to set to your security agencies in reference to counterterrorism? Is it always the highest level? Is it always eradicate terrorism, even if you know that it's impossible? Some people would answer positively, yes. Why? Because the decision maker has to put a North Star. And even if he knows that this would never be reached, it's giving the aim to all the agencies how to create their policies in a way that would try to get into the level of eradication of terrorism. Others would say, no, you need to have a more realistic goal and to set that, because if you want to do that, it will create some kind of despair, some kind of feeling of unsuccessfulness that would delude the motivation of those agencies to contend with terrorism effectively.
It makes sense, and I think I think the last part of what you said, it's also applicable to, for instance, combating crime. Similar. Can you eradicate crime from the planet? It's impossible, probably, but it might still be like a dot on the horizon where we're aiming at.
Right.
So I think can we summarize this as well, if I really simplify it, to if a terrorist organization, since we are talking about organizations, if an organization has zero motivation or zero capacities, a terrorist attack will not occur by that organization.
Exactly.
Perfect.
Exactly.
Let me stop sharing then. And then, yeah, we're back. So thank you for explaining this sheet. So it doesn't apply to lone wolves, I think, or lone actors, as people sometimes call it. So my question would be, why not? What challenges does a lone wolf offer to a government? And maybe in your answer, could you also define what we're talking about with a lone wolf or lone actor?
Definitely. Let's start with the definition. You know, I'm a freak of definitions, so let's start with the definition. The definition that I use for individual attacker, a lone wolf is a term that usually is not being used today. I won't get into the explanation why, but experts use the term individual attackers. The individual attacker is an individual, a person, who is deliberately conducting a terrorist attack without any operational tie to a terrorist organization. It doesn't mean that that person is not being influenced by a terrorist organization. He's not being incited by a terrorist organization. He's not necessarily refers to himself as a member of the organization. I mean, it could be an individual that if you would arrest him in Netherlands or any other place after the attack, he would say, I'm ISIS, I'm Al-Qaeda, but he's not. He was never being recruited to the organization, was not trained by the organization, and didn't get any operational support from the organization. He's being inspired by the organization. That's not enough in order to define him as a member of a terrorist organization. So that's the difference between an individual attacker and an organized terrorism phenomenon. Although sometimes the organization might send one person. I mean, take, for example, a suicide attacker. It's a one person at the end of the day that carry on the explosive and conduct the attack. So how this person is different from another person that it's stabbing the people, because the individual attacker is being inspired by the organization. The suicide attacker is being sent and got operational support from the terrorist organization. So that's the difference between the two. But as you have noted,
yeah.
Yes, Bart.
Yeah. So then the second question would be, what challenges does the lone wolf offer to the government?
Exactly what I wanted to refer to. As you have noted, it poses a different challenge. Yeah, we talked about the equation of terrorism: motivation, multiple operational capability. But in lone wolves, in most of them, not all of those attacks, in individual attacks, there is no meaning of capability. Only motivation is important. And why is that? Because many of those attacks, most of them, are being conducted with cold weapon. It could be stabbing, it could be using a knife or an axe, it could be a ramming attack with cars and trucks and so on and so forth. Here, there is no meaning of capability, because if you take a knife from your kitchen, you have the capability. If you take the car keys, you have a capability. So we cannot analyze, we cannot measure, and we cannot prevent or fight the capabilities of those terrorists. The question then is zooming in only on one part of the equation, and this is motivation. And here also we have a problem, because when we are talking about contending or preventing individual attackers or individual attacks, intelligence seems to be ineffective in this regard. And why is that? Let's double click for one moment on the term intelligence. Intelligence, if I need to go to the basis of what is intelligence or how intelligence works, usually classical intelligence has two arms: human and comment. Human is human intelligence, comment is communication intelligence. The common denominator for human and comment is that the intelligence agency is trying to intercept a discussion. I mean, you and I are the terrorists, and we are now discussing how to conduct a terrorist attack. If there is a third person in the room listening to us, he's going to his handler and he's telling him that you and me are planning a terrorist attack. That's human. This is how you intercept a discussion of two terrorists, knowing what their intentions are and the plot is. Communication is that when we are doing that on a Zoom discussion or a phone conversation or any other computer conversation, and then the intelligence, by communication intelligence, intercept the discussion and knows our bad intentions and our plans for the attack. This is how the way that for generations you intercept terrorist attacks. But when you're talking about individual attacker, there is no conversation in most cases. There are exceptions, but in most cases, it starts and ends with the sick mind of one person. He doesn't share this secret with anybody. He doesn't buy weapons. He doesn't have any intelligence radar signals that can be intercepted by the intelligence. And this is why intelligence is usually, I don't want to say impotent, but have much less capabilities to intercept lone individual attackers and not organized terrorism. Because in the organization, there is a discussion. There are many people which are involved in a suicide attack. There is the one who recruit the person, who train him, the one who build the bomb, the one who build the suicide, create the suicide belt, the one who is guiding him to the attack. There are many people which are involved, and they discuss the matter among themselves that can be intercepted. So that's practically the biggest challenge in countering individual attackers.
Yes, thank you so much for this, and I think it's also good for our viewers to think about this, because even if you want to, and there are reasons that we don't want this. Yeah, let's say that. Let's talk about an Islamist person, a lone wolf. So this person might radicalize. He might have shown signals, if we knew before, might have gone to a radical mosque at some point. But we don't, first of all, we can't, because of operational capabilities, of course, of intelligence or security forces. But maybe we even don't want that the fact that the government focuses on everyone who has any type of mindset that you could call radical, but that's far away from terrorism. So that can be a discussion about that. But even about like the ethical part of it, there is operational limitations to what a government can do, and that's the lone wolves or lone actors. They cause a serious challenge. So maybe before we finish the second part of our conversation, what could a government do, or where are chances? Could you share a bit about your experience, please?
Sure. I was quite pessimistic in the answer that I was giving, the previous answer that I was giving you, and now I'll be more optimistic, because this lacuna, this vacuum that was created within the intelligence is being filled up as we speak. And the solution that many intelligence agencies have found to that lake of humint and comment is by using open sources intelligence, and especially using machine learning, big data, and AI. This enormous capability, new capability, gives the opportunity for the intelligence services to identify exactly what you have said now, the early stages of radicalization, the early types of behaviors that can explain that the person is getting into a very dangerous process that might lead him to become a terrorist. If you wish, he's a potential terrorist. Now, that's a huge challenge. And as we speak, there are scientists around the world who are trying to fine-tune these types of capabilities, because it also includes a lot of dangers, moral dangers. Because think about the implications of that. You might approach a person and as a police officer and tell him, look, I'm arresting you. Why? Because you are a potential terrorist. But I'm saying, I'm not. I don't even think about terrorism right now. And you might say, you know what, you are right. You may be right. But my computer tells me that you are in the process. You don't know yet that you are going to be a terrorist. This is, of course, something which is inconceivable in a liberal democratic society. And the question is, what do you do with this type of person? Because you might get to them. The answer might be that you do not arrest those type of people. If this is, for example, a youngster, a 14 years old child, you approach his parents who doesn't know a glimpse about the radicalization process that their kid is experiencing right now. And you're telling the family, look, we know from our intelligence capabilities that your kid is in a very dangerous process right now. Pay attention, do whatever it's necessary to prevent this brainwash from getting into his mind and become a terrorist altogether. So even the counterterrorism policies should be adopted to the new types of technologies which are being developed as we speak in counterterrorism.
I think that's very nice to conclude the second part with. Maybe it's nice to add to this that in the Netherlands, and you probably do that in Israel as well, we indeed go to families of a potential terrorist, but we even go to the person, him or herself as well. See if we can cooperate with each other and find an alternative narrative for this person. So thank you for talking about the goals of counterterrorism policies. Thank you about talking about the lone actors and lone wolves. And I think what you just said is a nice bridge to the third part of our conversation, which will be a little bit more technical. We will talk about mis and disinformation and about future threats for the open societies we live in. So thank you, Boaz, and for the viewers, see you in the third clip.
Thank you, Bart.